Everyone, and welcome to tonight's session of Straight Talk, our online community forum. I'm Pam Duncan, and I am the CEO of Metropolitan Development Council, and I'm excited to say we have a great conversation lined up for you tonight. I am also joined by our facilitator for our conversations. That's my sidekick, Amanda Westbrook. Hi, Amanda.
Hello, Pam. It's good to see your beautiful face. And welcome to all of our guests and to our kind and gentle producer, Rob Huff. Tonight's conversation is the 46th in a series of discussions started last year. We hold weekly discussions around important topics impacting our community in Tacoma, Pierce County, and across the United States. Go ahead, Pam, take it away.
Well, May is Community Action Awareness Month, and tonight we are observing and celebrating it with a panel discussion from key community action leaders from across the U.S. as well as right here in Washington State. And remember, the most important message throughout the series of conversations is that there is hope always for our community. Right, Amanda?
Oh, always. We must find it every place we can. We would like to take a moment to acknowledge that this meeting is being conducted on the indigenous lands of the Puyallup people. We gratefully acknowledge that we rest on the traditional lands of the Puyallup people, where they make their home and speak the Lushootseed language. Throughout today's conversation, you can submit questions to be addressed by our speakers using the Q&A function in Zoom. We cannot promise we'll have time to consider every question, but we will make our best effort to get through the list in our allotted time. Now, I would like to introduce our guests for tonight's discussion. Denise Harlow is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Community Action Partnership, an organization that serves as a unifying force for 1,000 local community action organizations across the U.S. Welcome back, Denise.
Thank you, Amanda.
Jeff DeLuca is the Executive Director of the Washington Community Action Partnership, or WSCAP, which is a statewide organization supporting 30 local and county community action organizations across Washington State. Thank you, Jeff, for being here.
Thank you, Amanda.
And Vanessa Gaston, President of the WSCAP Board of Directors. Vanessa is the Director of Clark County Community Services, where she has served since 2007. Ms. Gaston has been instrumental in helping the department incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion principles. Her past experience includes 12 years in the Washington State government working for the Department of Social and Health Services and the Washington State Department of Veterans Affairs. She also served honorably in the U.S. Army. We say thank you for your service. Ms. Gaston has an extensive background with 29 years working with various human service, health, employment, and educational programs and issues. Welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Amanda.
You're more than welcome. And once again, thank you to everybody for being here. And of course, our producer, Rob Huff, is here also as well. Thank you, Rob, for putting together a great show for us today. Let's start like we do every week with a check of how everyone is doing in their hearts tonight. Or as I often say, what decisions, what ideas have you been wrestling with? And I'm not going to call on anybody for this answer. I'm going to let you answer as the Spirit moves you.
Well, I'll jump in. It is Community Action Month, and today is what we call Motivational Monday. And so there's so many things that inspire us on a daily basis and so many people who are inspiring to us and we've been pushing out a lot of quotes from folks. One that kind of sticks with me that just has really been resonating over the last few weeks as we've been trying to work to galvanize our country. It's from Dr. King: "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love." For me, this really says, and I use it in a lot of my presentations because for me, it grounds me in that we can, and our theme is a huggy heart and community action. We're about love and we're about, empathy and trying to help families, but without the power aspect of that to affect change upstream, it's anemic. Dr. King is exactly right. So for me, it's that balance right now. I know how tired everybody is, but staying motivated means that we have to put our power into action. So I'm looking forward to tonight's conversation, but that's just where I'd start where my head is at and my heart is at today.
Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you, Denise. Who else would like to jump in?
I'll go next. As Denise mentioned, we are celebrating community action. And I would say, we are born out of social justice. And right now is an important time for us to get back to our roots of social justice as we fight for and provide services and programs and advocate for people that are most vulnerable in our state and across our country, as we help people who are living in poverty, as we help the most marginalized, our communities of color, our people who are disabled, our people who are unhoused. We need to keep them in the forefront and keep their voices centered in our work. And that's what keeps me motivated, gives me hope, is because we have a purpose and a passion to make it better for everybody, particularly those populations that live amongst us. So thank you for asking this question.
Thank you for answering it. That was inspiring. What about you, Mr. Jeff, down there visiting your grandma?
Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Jeff DeLuca. I'm the executive director at Washington State Community Action Partnership, where I get to help lead this amazing network of 30 community action agencies who are, also part of this national organization, which Denise leads. And even as I come back to my hometown tonight for the first time in 17 months and get to have dinner with my grandmother and enjoy all of that, I also realized earlier today as I was driving by, I'm actually a block away from a community action satellite office of Palm Beach County Community Services, one of the public caps here in Florida. And so it's just a reminder that community action has such a broad reach and such a broad potential to impact people's lives and help communities fight poverty. It's just amazing that everywhere you turn, you can see what community action is doing in your community. You may have to look a little, you have to look a little, but it's there. And it's in the fiber and in the heartbeat of every community in this country.
I love that. That's a great reminder. Thank you. How about you, Ms. Pam? What's in your heart tonight?
I'm excited about the conversation that we are going to have tonight. As you know, Amanda, and as Rob knows, if anyone lends their ear to me for 2 minutes, I'm going to talk about community action. And the thing that really stirred me and pulled me in was a conversation that I had with Senator Jeannie Darnell shortly after my appointment in this role. And she said, "Pam, you have joined an elite cadre of community action directors, and don't take lightly what this role means and what you will be able to do in order to affect change in the community." And to hear that from an elected official and someone especially who I have had a great relationship with over the years and hold in high esteem just means so much. The more I learn about community action, and there's not a finite cutoff where it's like, okay, you know everything you need to know. It's ongoing. The more I appreciate and just treasure what community action means.
You know, you embody community action. So enough said, sister. Mr. Rob, your official title for MBC is Director of Communication and Advocacy. What's in your heart?
Well, I'm just thinking about this panel that we have today and all the wisdom that they bring to this conversation, how much I'm looking forward to that. And I'm just thinking about the impact of community action, and I'm really looking forward to hearing how these leaders mark this month of Community Action Month.
Yeah, well said, and especially with COVID. So one of the first questions I want to ask, we're gonna pick on Denise just for this question, and that is beginning with the basics, Denise, for our audience who perhaps doesn't fully understand what community action means, even though that poster behind you is really fabulous with the heart and the hug. I love that. Can you just give us the basics of what it is?
I love the advice that Pam referenced that she was given. It's a privilege and an honor to be able to serve this network of local organizations and their leaders. But it's that sense that whatever the community needs, your job as a community action agency is to address that need and to push the powers that be and step into that space and take your seat at the table to make that change. As Jeff referenced, there are 1,000 community action agencies all across this country, and we're not single service organizations. So I can't tell you that community action is about housing, or it's about energy assistance, or it's about early childhood. It's about all of that because it's about families. It's about communities. And what community action agencies, there are a few unique elements to community action agencies. They all are in and of the community. Whether they're a nonprofit entity or a public unit of local government, if they're a community action agency, they are driven and governed by a body of individuals that represent the community. Democratically selected individuals from communities with low income, elected officials, and the private sector working together across the community in communities that might be more conservative or more progressive all across America. These boards of directors come together to make decisions about what programs and services and activities they need to do. And they're basing those decisions based on a needs assessment that is done in every community across this country by community action agencies. And we are a highly accountable network. We don't provide the same set of services in any one organization because it's about one community might have an early childhood provider already. So our organization doesn't need to do that. We can refer and partner with. But it is about affecting change at the family and at the community level. It's both. It's both about the causes of poverty and the conditions. The conditions of poverty, people are hungry. People need a home. People need to keep the energy, the utilities on. But we have to go upstream. I heard earlier we're going to be referencing and talking about equity in this country, and we understand that poverty is undergirded by structural racism in our country. It's undergirded by unfair housing practices and unfair funding for school systems, right? There's so many inequities built into that, and Community Action's mission is to also go upstream and advocate on behalf of those policies. So it's both macro change and micro change. As Pamela mentioned, it's that leader has an obligation and a job to do, and agency directors are doing this all over the country. It is an amazing network of staff, of board members, of volunteers, touching the lives of 15 million people, at least every year in 99% of America's counties.
Wow. That's a TED Talk right there. That was incredible. Thank you. Thank you. So this is a question for everyone. Community action emerged from the War on Poverty, as we know, in 1964. What would each of you say has been the biggest impact of community action since its inception? And Vanessa, I'd like to start with you first, my dear.
I have been involved with community action for about 15 years. I used to serve on the board of what used to be called the Central Area Motivation Program, and it's now BurBar. And now I am the director of our designated CAP for our Community Action Agency in Clark County, and I've been doing that for over 13 years. And so I've seen it from a governance level, and I've seen it working directly on services. And we also have an advocacy role. Our Community Action Advisory Board is helping us with our advocacy as well as working with WSCAP. And so I think for me, just being on the ground and with the boots and just understanding the needs and constantly working during the legislative session to make sure they understand, whether it's on a national level with Congress or it's with state agencies, federal agencies, with our legislatures across our country. We are a movement, and every state is involved with delivering services, but also that advocacy on a legislative level and trying to impact policies on a consistent basis and speaking for people that are living in poverty. And Denise is right. We adapt to our communities. Every community action is involved in their community and they adapt their programs to their communities. And we are always evolving and adapting. So we are remaining flexible. We don't have a cookie cutter approach to how we serve this. And we have been doing that from the beginning. Every community that has community action will adapt based on those needs. And we use our data to influence those decisions. And so I would say that has been consistent from the very beginning. And we continue to do that. We even did that in our pandemic of how do we meet the needs in our community. And so I would say for me, that was probably the most influential piece there, is that you can't call us a cookie cutter or piece approach to that. We are policy advocacy, and we also deliver services in our community, and we remain flexible to meet the needs of the people in where we live. So that's what I would say is kind of what I would say is what has been fundamental for me.
I love that. I love that. Jeff, how would you answer that? What's the biggest impact been since 1964?
So building on what Denise and Vanessa have said about how community action exists to address both the causes and conditions of poverty, because we have been around as long as we have, 57 years now about, and we are still here. We've gone through many changes as a network in our history, from originally being founded through the Economic Opportunity Act, and then we were block granted in 1981. But we have survived and we've stayed around, and because we have such a laser focus on both the causes and conditions of poverty, the power in that is that we have the ability to help change attitudes and practices around how communities deal with poverty. That's been a big piece of our theory of change work here in the Northwest with our regional community action agencies. We had a regional conference last week where we brought community action agencies from Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska together. And as I was kind of just going through the fact sheets of all the different things that the agencies do, all told, those 56 agencies in our region leveraged over 2 million hours of volunteer service in 2019. That is a lot of people power, and a lot of people power that is focused on community resilience and helping our communities thrive. And now, as we dig out of COVID, hopefully build back better and with more attention to equity and inclusion, and really an inclusive recovery for everybody.
Mm-hmm. I can see that, absolutely. Denise, do you want to add anything to that in terms of what you perceive the biggest change has been?
Change lives.
Yes.
I've been we've been doing some site visits with the new director of the Office of Community Services, the political appointee at HHS who oversees our program at HHS. And part of these site visits have included customers of Community Action. So to be reminded face to face with individuals who've gone through programs and services of Community Action and to tell their story and to hear folks say, I found hope. I found a place where people treated me with dignity and respect, his words, not mine. That they knew that my life was my life. To see the changed lives, we can quote the numbers all day long, but the stories of family trees changing, families making new inroads on where they want to head and what success means to them. We win the war on poverty every day in this country, one family at a time. And I tell people, don't let anybody ever tell you any different. Community Action is changing lives every darn day.
And I am so grateful for that. Absolutely. My next question is, when we look at what's been the biggest shift in the work community action organizations have done since the arrival of COVID-19 last year. I mean, now that I have a really beautiful, clear, intimate picture of what what community action is, to wake up the next day and to have our lives totally changed, as Vanessa said, to be flexible and adaptable, boy, that is an understatement of the year. So what kind of shifts did we see happen? And Jeff, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think some of the bigger shifts that we saw in our network over the last year in particular have been the development of community partnerships. Community action, because of our, as Denise was saying, our board structure, the fact that we were able to bring the public and private sectors together, along with the voices of people living in poverty themselves, we are able to create broader new relationships in communities when we need to, in terms of delivering the emergency rental assistance program that was stood up here in Washington last year. There was a pretty historic effort to make sure that organizations that are by and for communities of color, low-income communities, LGBTQ communities, disability communities, organizations that have their roots in those communities were able to partner with the more, I don't want to say necessarily entrenched agencies like Community Action that are delivering, that have been delivering these services for a while. But I think there was an understanding in our region in particular that there was a need to expand those partnerships, to get deeper into communities, to think about how we interact a little bit differently. And that was, by all accounts so far, I think a pretty successful first attempt at that. It's been recognized by the National Low Income Housing Coalition as a promising practice. So, and that took partnerships with both the community action agencies, the other local organizations, our state funders at the Department of Commerce. And then the other piece that I think was also something that'll be remembered beyond the pandemic is just the way agencies were able to partner with the National Guard, for example, to ensure that food banks continue to operate, that families had enough food to eat throughout the pandemic. We saw hunger rates just spiking dramatically through the pandemic, but luckily those are starting to come down. The rescue packages had fairly robust food assistance in them. I'm seeing that pay off very well for my own family here in Florida right now. And, I think going forward, the lessons that we're going to take about that flexibility and the adaptability they have to stay with us, and they have to continue to influence how we operate in the community in the future.
Yes, absolutely. Pam, I want to bring you into this conversation as I also bring Vanessa and Denise in, because everybody's community is different. We all woke up with a different soul print that morning when we got the stay home order. So what has been the biggest shift for MDC during COVID-19?
I'm using a new device and I couldn't find my cursor. Okay, I'm here now.
Well, perhaps that's the biggest shift.
It actually, the pandemic did drive the need for a new device. One of the biggest shifts for MDC actually is this straight talk. The pandemic really elevated that there is a need to get information out to the community about what was going on with the pandemic. And for those of us privileged with the information, having this rapidly evolving set of information about what was going on and how it was impacting people, it also became very obvious to me that there are a lot of folks in the community who had no idea. I just thought about my own household. Folks had no idea what was going on. And so that was really the impetus for creating Straight Talk. Initially, the title was Community Conversations About Coronavirus. We just saw a need as a community action agency to ensure that information is getting out. So that has been a big shift for MDC. Instead of being solely a provider of services. That's just an example of a shift in what we've been doing.
That's great. Vanessa, you are headquartered in Vancouver, Washington, which is a very tiny little town, but it's got some powerful things happening in it. What was the shift that you experienced as a community action partner?
So we actually serve all of Clark County, and we're actually growing. We have almost a population of close to 500,000 in our county now. And so I would say what happened quickly is when that pandemic came in March, the state really relied on its existing networks. And I'm a public community action agency, so we primarily do funding, but we actually had to go into a direct service role. We actually had to open up a motel shelter and run it for people who had high risk for the pandemic. And so we ran that from April through December. And it was the biggest shelter in our community. We became part of our public health incident command. And we were actually there advocating for people that were low income, unhoused, the community marginalized. I mean, that's why they brought us there, to make sure we consider that population. We had never had that role before as far as being a part of a pandemic. And then all of that rental assistance from the federal government and the state and the utility assistance ran straight through our community action. And so our community action advisory board had to play a big role in helping to, whether we had to select organizations or make some quick decisions with guidance to our elected county officials. And so just to give you an example, my annual budget for my entire department, which has a lot of different programs, is about 29 million. By the time we get we got another round coming, we would have spent over 100 million since this pandemic. And it started in April. And so the staff, even though we went virtual, we had to move quickly because we knew people were in crisis and people lost jobs, people were hungry, people were homeless. We had to move. And so that was probably the biggest thing, is how flexible, how quick, but how the system, the funders relied on us so quickly to move quickly and get that going. So I would say that is probably one of the biggest things. Is it was hard. It was hard, and it really pushed the infrastructure boundaries. but our community came together. But because we were known in the community, because we had the relationships, we were able to pick that up and take that on. So that's what I would probably add to this right now.
And you just so gracefully and so humbly said, Vanessa, you know, we had never opened a shelter before, and my jaw like hit the table, because nothing like just in time training when you've got to find beds for people. It's like, oh, sure, we can do this. Just do it. So Denise, Alexandria, Virginia, which is where you are, is right there on the border of Virginia and Washington, D.C. So what you saw that morning when you woke up and had to pivot was also radically different from Pam and Jeff and Vanessa. What was the shift like for you during COVID-19?
Well, being the National Membership Association, our job is to help support the local agencies. And we're used to being certainly in person and working remotely. We know that the privilege we have, though, to be able to work from our dining room, literally from my dining room table, right, for 15 months. But we're serving a network of organizations who had to pivot and did pivot to use technology in new ways so families could apply for the services that are flowing through, to help our agencies figure out how to and help them support as they pivoted to receive all these new dollars that, and so, you want more resources to serve families. It's the administration and the accountability pieces behind the scenes to try to navigate all of that. Early in the pandemic, I would sometimes slip and say, when are agencies reopening? When I was talking sometimes, and they say, Denise, it's not about reopening. We've been open. Our doors may be physically closed, but community action never closed during the pandemic. They have pivoted all across this country. And the example that people are talking about in terms of rental assistance and statewide funders turning to community action networks within states, we saw that across this country, where rental assistance flows through a community action network because that infrastructure has been there for 57 years. They could pivot because they were there. They're part and of the community, and they're mission first, mission focused. And I follow a lot of community action on social media and got to see them, throughout, face to face with families. They're the ones putting the food in the trunk of the cars. They're still operating face to face programs and services because shelters need to be run. Families need safe places to stay. And now we're in the midst of vaccinations need to happen. People need transportation to get to vaccinations. Call centers families need assistance to navigate some of those challenges. And agencies are continuing to pivot and learn new things every day that they're sharing with each other. But we've done some reports on just the fantastic pivots agencies have done across this country. And I would argue we're a case study in what works. And that infrastructure allows for local disaster recovery. Sometimes we've seen in hurricanes and earthquakes and tornadoes and such. This was global. This was national. This was everywhere. There wasn't part of the country who could rely and support another part of the country. And so what we saw is every municipality, every community action agency found their own way. And that infrastructure just matters so much to be able to share lessons, whether it's within the state of Washington, within that region that Jeff talked about, or even nationally across this country.
Absolutely. Yeah. That morning, what all of you have in common is you woke up and went, let's cling to each other, because every community has their own issue here that we've never had before, but I bet you know how to solve this. So it made it even stronger. One of the things, and Pam said this very, very early on, was she said there was the pandemic of COVID-19, and then there was the pandemic of Black Lives Matters, George Floyd, and all of the subsequent murders that have happened after that. So question for you is this. Can each of you offer some thoughts on how the community action organizations are working toward social and racial justice? Because COVID-19 has made that even more clear. The 400 years of work we have to turn around. So I'm going to let any one of you jump in on that.
I'd like to start. As you mentioned, Amanda, COVID-19 really illuminated everything, all the disparities, the disproportionalities, the inequities, right? And we actually had a conversation about the intersectionality of COVID-19 and race shortly before the murder of George Floyd, where we just really talked about how COVID is just one more thing, another layer of oppression, if you will, for communities of color. And then shortly thereafter, we had a session where we openly grieved about the recorded murder of a Black man. It's not that it had not happened before ever. It was that this time it was caught on, it was recorded and people around the world saw it. For community action, and I will start from a very local level, MDC had already begun discussing the imperative for not standing solely on being an anti-poverty organization, but that our foundation must be that of anti-poverty, anti-racism, and social justice. Now, I will say that when that was initially brought up, some people nodded their heads. They were like, I get it, but I'm kind of concerned about, so how is the community going to respond to that? And then fast forward 1 year, nobody had to do any more preaching about it, right? Nobody had to be evangelical about it. What is really evident is that this is not just the topic or the issue of the day. It's not just a hot thing to become engaged in. It is evident that if we are to be moving families forward, if we are to be strengthening the trajectory of those who we serve and making it a strong upward trajectory, we have to stand firmly and with conviction on how important it is to be an anti-racism focused organization, period. And what I really have loved is how I have seen that this is not something that is embraced by the local community action agencies, but it's statewide. These are the conversations we're having on a state level. And when I have listened to NCAP, led by Denise and Brian Duncan, the chair, like openly state this is important, and not with hesitation, not with, oh, maybe this is okay, but to put that stake in the ground about the imperative for addressing the injustices that people have not wanted to address.
Yes. As Jeff said, causes and conditions. And, racism probably wasn't a bullet point at that point until George Floyd. Denise, I want to hear from you. What are you thinking? I saw you doing this and I thought, boy, those wheels are turning in her head.
Well, tomorrow's the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. And Community Action was born in 1964 in the same soil as the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act. And we come of and are from a social justice, racial justice movement from day one. And we've, and I know Dr. Gail Christopher has been out to regional conferences and such as well in the Pacific Northwest. And Dr. Christopher has led an effort for one of her pieces of her frame is the truth, racial healing, and transformation perspective when it comes to changing our country's trajectory when it comes to race. But as she says, it starts with truth.
Mm.
And we must change the narrative. We talk about changing the narrative on poverty to talk truth to power. And we have to change the narrative and what we understand as a country about racism in our country, our historical constructs and frames. We are not taught our history in our country. And it's so important for community action to speak truth and to do what we can to change that narrative. And we were blessed in April to host the National Community Action Equity Summit. And we enlarged our container, as our Vice President of Practice Transformation, Tiffany Marley, likes to say. We start with race. Racial equity is at our center. We look at gender, we look at sexuality, we look at disability issues, we look at age. The container is everything. We must keep a very broad scope, but we must understand that structural racism in this country, again, as I said, undergirds poverty. It is at its core. And again, Dr. Christopher, truth, racial healing, bridging and belonging, and we could talk more about that. And then we have to find ways to transform our country, to transform our world. But it's where community action started, and it's deep in our roots today.
Yes. Vanessa, I think about you with your background in the military. I think about just the heavy responsibility on your shoulders for what you do. And I wonder how race has played a role in that with COVID-19. You are in a very rural community out there, and what racism looks like in Tacoma, Washington may look different in Vancouver, Washington. I don't know. But how did it affect what you do when you woke up that morning and realized COVID-19 was here to stay? And also, we're seeing signs of BIPOC communities that are just suffering and dying now that we can see the inequities.
I would say my department, I've been here over 13 years. We have been working on diversity for a long time, but we never really looked at race equity. And it wasn't until about 2.5, 3 years ago that we took that very seriously. And actually, there were some community partners where we decided we wanted to look at equity through a race lens and understand racism in a systemically way. Our county, I'm with the county, Clark County, and our county board, our public health, has declared systemic racism a public health crisis. And so my department has taken that very seriously. Clark County is kind of we get a lot of people from Portland. Portland is a pretty big city, so you have a lot of people that move here, but we're a pretty white area. Growing diversity, but we're not as diverse as probably Tacoma would be. And what it was just stark, disparities when you started to look at the data. And part of the problem with institutional racism is that it's an afterthought almost. And so it's like the situation has to get worse before you start to think about, oh, should I do something? And so it actually took our advocates, our community-based grassroots level organizations that are run by volunteers who don't get paid. It took people like myself to just really come to the table and just keep bringing it forth. And then really, I think what happened with George Floyd, it allowed people, because there was a lot of protests down here in Portland. And so we get a lot of the Portland news in our area. It allowed people to see directly what racism can be about. I've been dealing with racism my whole life. I was born in the United States. You don't have to convince me racism exists. I know it exists. And so really trying to help my community partners, my staff, and I'm grateful because we have been working on it for a while. My staff are prepared for that conversation. So we are now working internally to look at what is wrong with our organizational policies and practices that may be part of institutional structural racism that we need to change. Then actually working with partners in the community to talk about what needs to change. You know, we have served on committees advocating that they make sure that they address the disparities in the communities of color and make sure that funding goes to address those disproportionalities. But that's a beginning. That's just a beginning. That was a Band-Aid approach. We've got to do some things to address systems and policy that have caused some of these creations. And so as a county and as we're a funder and we work directly with our nonprofits, and I'm grateful that our nonprofits have really rolled up their sleeves to try to figure out how to do this work in our community. We're all in it together. And on a statewide, as far as WSCAP, you know, we've been working on it for 3 years. We've had a consultant. This is some hard stuff. This is some hard conversations that is not easy for people to have, and some people don't want to have these conversations. But if we're truly going to look at poverty and address poverty, you got to have the conversation. And every part of this state has some community of color, whether it is Latinx, whether it is Indigenous, whether it is people from different Asian and Pacific Islander, or Black or African. There are people of color that live all over this state. And we have got to recognize that and know that when you look at your own data, they are doing worse off. And so we have got to do something to address it. It is our responsibility. We didn't create this problem, but we got to do something about it if we're going to truly be about standing for our mission. So I would say, you know, that and our community, Clark County, you know, we're not as diverse, but we do have some organizations who have rolled their sleeves up, who are very serious about how do we address this. It is not going to be an easy fight, but we have to be in it to win the war. We got to win the war. This is a marathon. This is not a sprint. This didn't happen overnight. So we have got to be in it to address it. And we've got to be in it together. And we've got to have the hard conversations. And we cannot go backwards. There's no such thing as going back to normal. There is no such thing. And we don't want to go back to normal because people were hurt when we were back to normal. So it's time to look at what is something different. And I always say, someone mentioned to me one time, I don't want to see a change. And I agree with them. I don't want to see a change. I want to see the change. And so let's figure out what that looks like.
Very well said. Jeff, before I get your thoughts on that, we have a question from our audience. And actually, I'm going to have Jeff, I'm going to have you answer it. How's that? Or to start off with. And this is from an individual who is, boy, he leads the way with helping the unhoused here in our community. He is greatly admired and does amazing work. And his question is, what does the community need to do to support and grow the work of community action? Mr. Jeff?
I would start by saying, get involved, find out about your local community action agency, no matter where that is in the country, because we are in 99% of the counties. Find a opportunity to either get involved on a board, to donate so that these agencies have discretionary dollars that they can leverage, because I'll tell you, one of the biggest challenges that I've seen community action agencies having is, and it even goes back to the Recovery Act. It's always feast or famine in terms of how we invest in this country in social services. It's like, oh, there's a crisis. We're going to throw a whole bunch of money at you, and you got 3 to 4 months to spend it. And, you may see your budget increase by 60%, but the funding that's attached to that is only going to allow you to increase your staff capacity maybe 15%. So we at Community Action, no matter what the funding constraints are, we show up. We need the community to also show up for us. And I look at Community Action as, and one of the things that really brought me to wanting to lead this network is because I see it as an opportunity to put democracy into practice at the local level. It's because the community gets to decide how these funds are spent, how these services are directed toward the needs in those communities, how potentially we could lead conversations in our community about the realities of poverty, of how race plays out in our communities, how sexism plays out in our communities. You know, I think the number that came out in January was about 133,000 women are out of the workforce right now in Washington state just because of childcare. There's no worker shortage. There's a childcare shortage. There's a vaccine access shortage, and people don't feel safe going back to work. We need communities to be advocates around what the real causes and systemic barriers to poverty reduction are. And community action is the most unique vehicle, I think, that exists institutionally in this country to elevate those conversations at the local level.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Pam, do you want to add anything to that? I see your hand was raised. Where's that button, Pam?
I found it. That was actually a mistake hand raise.
Oh,
It was more like, yeah, it was like,
it was one of these.
yes.
I love that.
And really, I can't even add anything to what Jeff just said.
Yes. I think that's the answer. So let's move on. I want to talk about how community action organizations are helping across the country to fend off the threat that comes with the end of the current eviction moratorium. And that is, ooh, when I say that, my chest gets so tight because I just imagine it. I don't imagine good things. I imagine a lot of unhoused people because of the fear and because of the red tape. So I'd like to hear from our three guests. What are you doing in your community to help get that off-ramp be as seamless as possible? I'll let you jump in as you see fit.
Well, I can start at the national level, at least. First of all, not everybody benefited from a moratorium. People were still evicted across this country, and oftentimes the most vulnerable of families who, whether documentation status for immigration status and other things, placed many, many families at risk. So the moratorium didn't protect everybody. And even with the moratorium and rental assistance being available, many families are at risk. Even if the rent ends up being paid up through assistance, families still are at risk of being evicted. And so community action agencies in many, many places around this country are working very closely with their states. Some places, states opted for different models for rental assistance, which is a little concerning because we think community-based organizations, nonprofits, governmental entities who understand families are the best place for those dollars to go. And so it's prepping the network to be able to get these dollars out. But our agencies have been doing rental assistance from day one, whether they've used their flexible federal community services block grant dollars, state dollars, local dollars for rental assistance. We've seen agencies develop really close relationships with landlords. We saw this again 10 years ago during the Great Recession and rapid rehousing, trying to get people back into homes and keep them in homes. We've learned a lot. And so those relationships with landlords are happening all across the country. And landlords should turn to community action for that, is to help ensure that they get the rental paid. And these monies will be here for a while, but there's a lot of debt load. And it's not just rent, it's utilities. And the debt load is just immense. And so there's so much work to do.
Yeah.
I can jump in with a quick summary of some of the developments at the state level with our state legislative session that just ended about a month ago. And there were three very significant housing bills. One, to start, Washington State had probably one of the strongest, if not the strongest, eviction moratorium in the United States, which was very, very helpful. But it also drove the vacancy rate down from, it was probably 2% to even closer to 0%. So you have landlords who are eager to get certain people out. So now they are, for example, we're hearing reports of people, landlords offering like $5,000 for people just to move at the end of their lease. Even if some of these new laws that I'll tell you about go into effect. Now that they are going into effect, landlords are still trying to buy people out, but where is there to go if there's no supply of affordable housing? In terms of people making 80 to 100% of area median income, we have about 99 units for every 100 people that need them. But if you are making 30 to 80% AMI, there may only be like 30 units for every 100 people that need them. So the supply is very scarce. Luckily, our state over the last couple of years has been significantly increasing its investment in our state housing trust fund. There's also, just this year, they put in $120 million for rapid acquisition of motels and places like that that can be converted into shelter space. We have a just cause eviction law statewide now. There are now, I believe it's 16 enumerated reasons that you can evict somebody. There is an off-ramp to the eviction moratorium that is supposed to help protect people from getting evicted based on accumulated pandemic debt. We're hoping that the governor currently our eviction moratorium is supposed to end June 30th. We're hoping that Governor Inslee will extend that by at least one more month to allow some of these systems to get stood up and make sure that rental assistance is able to reach communities in time. And the other big forward-moving piece that we got done this year was Washington State is now going to be the first state to provide a civil right to counsel for anyone going through an eviction. In cities where this has been tried, New York City, Seattle passed it, I think maybe a year ago or so, and they were just starting to maybe get it going. But landlords like it because they like being able to work with a professional to settle disputes out of court. It actually adds efficiency to the system, and we have an Office of Civil Legal Aid in this state where folks are able to access that, and that is now going to be, because of another law that was passed, available to undocumented people. So that is a lot of moving parts that are happening at the same time that all show a lot of promise for people who are facing housing insecurity, but how it's actually going to play out when it all goes into effect in the next month or two is still a big question mark.
Yes, it is. Vanessa, how is it playing out in Clark County?
I think, so the funding that we got from whether it's the state or federal government to help people during this pandemic really was for people who already had housing. So you had to have some connection to the pandemic, have some impact by it. And it was around people for at least 50% of the area median incomes. So our goal has been, let's pay these landlords as many as people as possible. We have pretty much spent through and allocated all the funding that we've gotten so far. We just got another a group of funding from the second eviction rental assistance program from the Department of Treasury from the federal government. So we will get our money directly. And then I think the state's looking at some more. So, but it doesn't meet all the need. There is such a huge need. It was not enough to serve everybody. We work closely with Clark Public Utilities to try to pay the utility bills. The cities came in and tried to hit water bills and sewer bills. So it was all hands on deck to try to help as many people, but it did not address everything. One of the things that we learned with this, that there was no funding for the unhoused to even get into some rental. And so, and we have been working over the last 5 years to build some more affordable housing, working with our housing authority and nonprofit developers. So we had some housing going, but those units filled up fast. And so we're now working with those developers to do some bank some land so that we know we've got to, we're not seeing the private side to build affordable housing. So we're going to have to figure out what can we do, have a multi-pronged approach. So build some housing, look at different kind of sheltering, 24/7 sheltering, look at how do we join these services together in a very different way, keep people in their homes as much as possible. But the next thing we're looking at, which we're realizing, like, we need to look at some home ownership. And so we're going to work with our housing authority and a nonprofit that does a land trust type of model. And we do some of that now, but it's very small. We need to do more of that because we need to free up some of this affordable housing that the nonprofits have and hopefully create a continuum. So as they move for wherever they're at, so if they're in a shelter, transitional housing, and go into affordable housing or permanent supportive housing, hopefully we can get some folks who are ready to move into home ownership and just kind of move people through this continuum, because we need to do something to free up housing because it's not getting any worse. And I would say that's what we've been doing so far. But it is tight. Like Jeff said, it is tight. There's some vacancies, but those apartments are extremely expensive, and our folks just can't afford to stay there. So that's what I would say we've been working hard to do. I think every county, every CAP agency across the state has been trying to work hard in that same strategy. So.
Thank you, Vanessa. Pam, give us a snapshot of Pierce County.
I was thinking about all of the conundrums that have already been elevated, and the I won't say it, the irony, but the unique situation that MDC is in, because we are a housing provider as well as an advocate for those who reside in the units. And everything that you've already heard expressed about folks who are behind on rent, even with rental assistance, there are still people who are behind on their rent. And this is a conversation we were having this time last year. Of course, people's arrearages weren't as high as they were going to get, but people were being impacted and were not able to, or made decisions not to pay their rent. And what we were hearing from the state level, the Department of Commerce, is this time next year, whenever the moratorium ends, we're talking about massive numbers of families, households being evicted. And so what has been happening with the moratorium is just a delay, perhaps, of the inevitable. Mm-hmm. And then what do you do? And we completely understand every issue pertaining to this, like what it means to advocate for those who are perhaps facing the eviction, and also what it means as a housing provider when you have debt accumulating and folks are not able to pay their rent or not responding to the outreach, so that we can have those conversations with those folks who can, Tacoma Pro Bono will help with negotiating things. And it's a really, really tough situation. And I was just thinking, I wish I knew the answer. We know, however, that there has to be, like you said, making that off-ramp seamless whenever the moratorium ends. And how do you address it when you have less affordable housing than what the need dictates?
Yes. In addition to, on top of that, here in Tacoma, we have an unhoused issue where we have so many unhoused people sleeping in public places. So it's not like it's falling on a solid foundation. We're already in dire straits.
Yeah.
Last question. I want to close out tonight's conversation by asking everyone here, where are you finding hope right now? And I'm going to let you jump in as the Spirit moves you.
I'll start and just say, by just being with the folks here tonight.
Mm.
Having conversations with people who are in the work every day is so inspiring. And I've used the phrase, I'm blessed to be as tired as I am, because we know so many folks have lost jobs and things like that. But to be able to do a job with folks like who are around this table tonight, it gives us all hope. So
I'm going to remember that phrase there, Miss Denise. Blessed to be so tired.
Mm.
Yeah. Who else? Who else finds hope, or where do you find hope?
I'll go next. I would say I really appreciate my colleagues in Washington across the Community Action Network, because we have all been together over this last year, working hard to serve our communities and lifting each other up. So I appreciate that. I appreciate all my community partners in Clark County, all the nonprofit providers, all the funders, public and private. My staff, I have some wonderful staff, because it's like people roll their sleeves up and just say, we need to get in this together and figure this out. And so I have a wonderful community, and I have to say, I love my job, but this was a trying year. But everybody here, just I commend them for really putting their hearts into this to want to try to help our community. So that's what keeps me going. That's what keeps me going with all of the social justice issues, with all of the issues with poverty, with all of the people, businesses struggling with. It was a trying year. But for those who just said, unselfishly gave of themselves, their money, their time, those who chose to go get vaccinated, those who chose to follow the rules and wear a mask and social distance for the good of public health of everybody, I appreciate that. So that's what kept me going and keeps me going.
Thank you, Vanessa. What about you, Jeff?
I want to agree with everything Denise and Vanessa just said. This is a really challenging time to be in leadership. I became executive director of WSCAP 3 months before the pandemic started. And I hired both of my new staff 3 weeks before the stay-at-home order was issued. But like clockwork, everything started to fall into motion, and we were able to immediately build partnerships with local organizations and the Department of Commerce and Emergency Management to distribute. We ended up distributing last summer 750,000 pieces of personal protective equipment to every corner of Washington State. And it's hard to track, but I'm sure that saved some lives, probably saved some people from at least going to the hospital. Everyone being willing to stick this out, keep showing up, do what we're supposed to do, keep advocating for staying the course so that we can come out of this better than we started. That's what keeps me going.
I love that. Pam, I'm going to let you have the last word here about where you're finding hope. And then I'm going to ask you to drive us home and tuck us in as you do every Monday night.
Thank you, Amanda. I want to say thank you to Amanda as well. You have been here consistently as my partner in these conversations, and you have done it with your heart on your sleeve as well. It's people like you who give me hope. It's my counterparts, definitely the guests who are on our episode tonight, who are not just guests, like we have this one touch interaction, but it's ongoing. I can reach out to any of them for anything that I need. And whether it's technical assistance or it's encouragement, it's support, it's, hey, have you thought about this? Taking this approach, here's what somebody else is doing. It's being part of the elite cadre of those who are in community action that gives me hope. I'm telling you, from the time I heard that statement made, if I had any questions about community action before then, there was just no doubt at all afterwards. It was like, I have just been handed the golden egg. Community action truly, truly gives me hope. And I'm so glad that it's part of United Way's URL. Our website is mdc-hope.org, and there's a reason for that. And of course, it's all of the folks who show up, whether they are part of the MDC team internally, or they're the folks who just work tirelessly in our community, and all of the different ways. If it's our funders who we can have conversations with and say, hey, you need to think about this. This must be a priority. Or it's the folks who just labor without being compensated financially for what they do to make a difference in people's lives. Those are the things that give me hope. Those are the things that I am reminded of every single day. This is why we do the work that we do, because there is hope.
Yes.
That is my drive us home and tuck us into bed as well. I just want to say to Denise, Vanessa, Jeff, thank you so much, not just for making the time to be here this evening, but for what you do every single day. A lot of times it's behind the scenes, but you still show up with conviction and commitment. And I want to thank you. And of course, to Rob Huff, who is our producer, our director of advocacy and communications, who also gets it. Thank you so much as well. And I just want to thank everyone who showed up, whether you listened to us live or live streamed via Facebook. Thank you for making the time to listen to this conversation. Feel free to reach out to us if you have questions. You can reach out directly to me, even Pam D at mdc-hope.org, and we'll be happy to get your questions, your comments responded to, and forwarded on to others if that's the case. Thanks again for joining us. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks.
Thank you.